Well, hello again. I just won't go away, will I? Or it's you that's not going away, if you, in fact, you're watching and listening to this. What we have left in this unit is primarily a look at the colonial economies in the Americas and the social relations that sort of sprung up around and because of them, with a little bit at the end on some religious developments as well. This is split into kind of three categories, regionally speaking. So we'll look at the Spanish Empire and basically South and Central America, a little bit into North America, the smaller but significant Portuguese Brazilian Empire, and then economic developments in North America proper, or a larger part of North America, in the hands of the English, the Dutch, and French colonists. So Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, Dutch in North America. Starting with mining and agriculture in the Spanish Empire. So this is the main way that Spain made economic hay, extracted wealth from their New World colonies. Mining first, and by far more profit came from that, but some came from agriculture as well. We already know that the Spanish in conquering the Aztecs and Incas were able to then get a hold of their gold and silver mines, and the two big sites were, and most of this was silver. So there was a lot more silver taken out than there was gold, but there were some of both, and gigantic amounts. Zacatecas, Mexico, and Potosi, Bolivia, it's now Bolivia, were sort of the two big sites for silver mining. Mostly voluntary labor was used here, but it was needed in huge numbers because they're extracting a great deal of silver. There were some draft workers, and the draft worker meaning they were forced into it, something akin to slave labor, at least temporarily or long term even. But for those that were drafted against their will, the conditions tended to be more dangerous, high death rates, because they were given the tougher, harder jobs. Potosi, to the south, in South America, was a boom town. Started out as sort of hardly anyone living there, but as silver became a bigger and bigger enterprise and industry there, by about 1600, the population was about 150,000. So this was big business for the day indeed. Felipe Fernandez Armesto, in his book on world history, says Spain had the advantage of privileged access to the silver mines of Mexico and Peru. But the importance of the silver sent back to Spain was not so much in its total value as in its predictability. While these shipments remained regular until the second or third decade of the 17th century, they gave Spanish kings much better credit ratings than other rulers of the time. So we don't usually think of gold and silver as about credit, but the fact that they were consistently bringing out lots of gold and silver allowed them to get even more money by taking out loans from bankers back in Europe who trusted them because there was such a large and continuing supply of gold and silver. But of course, I think you can see that that's not going to be true forever. Gold and silver veins tend to eventually run out. And this did happen to Spain eventually. And then their credit rating went into the tank. But that's later. Silver was becoming increasingly important on world markets, just as luck would have it. Luck for the Europeans and the Chinese both. You see this in the little graphic on the left, global silver trade. The Ming Dynasty, government of China at the time, empire, began to pay its official salaries to its many bureaucrats, civil servants, in silver, and began to collect taxes in silver, which basically means their monetary system was silver. Everyone's trying to acquire silver, even if you were a business person before that just did barter and traded stuff for stuff. you're not going to any longer if you can, because your taxes have to be paid in silver anyway. So you better start dealing in silver yourself. At that same time, approximately, silver deposits in Japan, but we're talking about the ones here in the Spanish colonies, again, Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, the Americas, were discovered then. So this is something we talked about in an earlier unit. The Europeans, before they got to the New World, conquered it, colonized it, didn't have very many products and commodities, resources that people in Asia wanted, so there's a trade imbalance. But once they were able to take control in the Americas, that changed, particularly with regard to silver, because and there's other reasons why silver was trading basically as a currency in Europe as well. But the big thing was this change in China, which happened almost exactly at the same time that the silver mines were discovered by the Spanish and taken by the Spanish. The hacienda. Now we go from mining to agriculture. As Professor von Sivers says, to support the mining centers and administrative cities, I mean the big cities where the government offices and bureaucrats were in the Spanish Empire in the New World, the Spanish colonial government encouraged the development of agricultural estates. These estates first emerged when conquistadors, former soldiers, used their encomienda rights to round up Native American labor to produce subsistence crops. A majority of landowners produced wheat and animals for sale to urban and mining centers. Entrepreneurs received commissions to provide slaughterhouses with regular supplies of animals. So a lot of former soldiers and officers who were owed payment for their military service for Spain and for one of the conquistadors like Cortez or Pizarro or others, are sometimes paid off in land. And encomienda rights meant rights to Native American local labor, and these people then entrenched themselves more or less with free labor and wisely started to grow crops that were needed in the cities, in mining centers, administrative cities, mostly cattle and grains, staple crops like wheat. The encomienda system that I just mentioned was supposed to be, or at least it was sold, as being beneficial to both settlers, Spanish and Indians or Native Americans alike. As the graphic here says, it didn't work out that way. The plan was Spanish settlers were to protect, care for, and Christianize, meaning convert Native Americans to Christianity. The Indians were to work a portion of their time for Spanish settlers, a portion of their time. However, the way it worked out, in reality, Spanish settlers forced long hours and days of labor, didn't pay Indian workers, and failed to protect the Indians, which was part of the deal, and ended up seizing a lot of their own lands, because the original intent, at least what was stated, was that Native Americans would have their own plots of land, however small, that they could work on part of the time and then work part-time on the Spanish owners' land. But I think you can see the way it was sort of set up allowed landowners quite quickly to sort of extend and expand the responsibilities of Native Americans. And in time, Native Americans died from diseases, harsh living and working conditions, diseases sometimes coming from overwork, right? Poor health and poor nutrition and disease are often linked. So the Spanish clergy, at least parts of it, Catholic priests, started to complain about this as an injustice for humanitarian reasons. And through some of their efforts, the more prominent of them the encomienda system was recalled, but it was replaced with something called the repartimiento, which was supposed to be better and reform. But as so often happens with reforms of laws that aren't working, they tweak them here and there, and it's supposed to solve the problem, and it doesn't. It probably made things slightly better, but still abusive and certainly unjust, and then some to Native Americans. Moving to Portuguese Brazil, if silver mining was the big way to make money in the Spanish Empire and for Spain, for the Portuguese, it was sugar growth, sugarcane growth and processing of sugar, which was a gigantic product on world markets. Everybody loves sugar worldwide for obvious reasons. It's somewhat addictive, and sweets taste good. We seem to have, there's some evidence of this in our genetic structure through the process of evolution, a natural inclination towards sweets. If you have a sweet tooth and you eat too many sweets, it's not good for you, and you gain weight, that can make you feel a little bit better. It seems to be part of our biological nature. I use it as an excuse all the time, so you can too. As Bentley says, our lovable textbook author, one of them anyway, the Portuguese Empire in Brazil depended on the production and export of sugar. The different economic and social foundations of the Spanish and Portuguese empires led to different patterns of labor recruitment. Portuguese nobles and entrepreneurs established sugar plantations in the regions without the administrative machinery to recruit workers and relied instead on imported African slaves as laborers. Africans and their descendants became the majority of the population in Brazil, not simply an auxiliary labor force as in Spanish America. So in Spanish America, slavery was there, and it was cruel, as slavery always is, but it was less a part of the labor system and became the primary labor system for the Portuguese sugar planters, which means growers, big plantation owners. The engenho, this was sort of the Portuguese sugar mill. But technically it meant sort of the mill itself and how the machine operated. But the word came to be used and is even now to talk about the entire system of sugar plantation production. Again, reading from Bentley, colonial Brazilian life revolved around the sugar mill, engenho. It came to represent a complex of land, labor, buildings, animals, capital, and technical skills related to the production of sugar. So that's, again, sort of the whole plantation, but technically, originally the word just meant sort of the mill itself, the piece of machinery that processed the sugar. Unlike other, along with the labor that worked the machinery. Unlike other crops, sugarcane required extensive processing to yield molasses or refined sugar as a profitable export. Engenhos were among the most complex business enterprises in the Americas, and Portuguese planters and owners of sugar mills were a privileged class exercising political, social, and economic power. So the wealthiest folks, for the most part, in Portuguese Brazil were Portuguese nationals or Creoles, children of immigrants from Spain, and usually rich ones. And this, in many cases, ownership of a sugar plantation made them even more wealthy. So slavery in Portuguese Brazil, not surprisingly, was brutal, and probably more so even than in the Spanish colonies. Again, Professor Bentley tells us Portuguese plantation managers imported slaves as early as the 1530s, but they began to rely on African labor on a large scale only in the 1580s. The labor demands of cane cultivation, sugar cultivation, and sugar production, meaning processing it through all of the technology, exacted a heavy toll from slave communities. arduous working conditions, mistreatment, tropical heat, poor nutrition, and inadequate housing combine to produce high rates of disease and mortality, typically 5 to 10% annually. As in most other plantation societies, the number of deaths usually exceeded the number of births, so there was a constant demand for more slaves. That's a telling statistic, or those are telling statistics, that the death rates usually outpaced the birth rates, hence the demand for more slaves to be imported, forced from Africa. Fur traders and settlers in North America. So now we get to kind of the third regional area, and we're dealing here with English, French, and Dutch colonists, though we won't always distinguish between the three, but we will a bit. Most of the fur that was in great demand worldwide, and particularly in Europe, were beaver pelts. The poor beavers didn't fare so well, because when beaver populations fell because of so much trapping and hunting, trappers moved further and further away to trap in new areas. And I should say that it was Native Americans that did almost all of the trapping, and the French, primarily the French, but other Europeans involved in the trade, they then came in to buy the furs or trade something else for the furs. Why didn't the French, the Europeans, trap the furs? Because they weren't nearly as good at it as Native Americans, who had been doing it for thousands of years. So they just said, "Forget it. We're not adept at this. So we'll contract with them." So they're remunerated handsomely enough to motivate them, and they'll go out, trap the beaver. We'll take the beaver pelts and turn them into all kinds of things, fabrics, and clothing items that Europeans loved. But the fact that the fur trade was so big, there was so much demand, that whole areas just sort of were after a certain period of time, devoid of any beaver. They're all gone. So Native American groups and tribes would have to move further inland or somewhere else, and this caused them to run into each other and compete for dwindling supplies of beavers, or ecosystems where they still remain. So violence and warfare resulted between Native American groups. The 17th century Beaver Wars, they're sometimes called. Yes, that sounds sort of strange, but there are wars over all kinds of resources. Native Americans in California had acorn wars over acorns, which sounds equally as strange. This was a war primarily between two rather powerful tribes, the Iroquois and the Huron. One who allied themselves with the English, another who allied themselves with the French. And this then brings in the other factor that helped to make this all much more competitive and more violent. The European merchants and European countries who sort of lured and made these sort of lucrative deals, basically, is part of what's causing, or part of what was causing the Native American tribes to compete with each other, because a lot of them know, because it's not just the Iroquois and the Huron, a lot of them know if we don't deliver more beaver pelts and better quality and on time and all that, our trading partners, either the English or the French, are going to go to our neighbors, and we'll lose the business. So the European demand, market demand, capitalist, supply and demand issues made it such that the competition was so heavy that the European pressure put on them caused even more problems between Native Americans. So Native Americans had been fighting each other, for a long time before Europeans arrived. Not all the time, but wars were certainly known. But these wars became kind of increasingly brutal, and a lot of it again was pushed by what the Europeans are trying to get out of this, which is wealth extracted through the fur trade. Settler society in North America, in a general sense, English, French, Dutch, settlers were more of a threat than fur traders, to Native Americans that is, since they sought to displace the indigenous peoples from the land entirely. So fur traders, the French were less of a threat because the French didn't settle as much. There were certainly some French settlers in Canada, but they weren't primarily settler-oriented colony or colonies. They were there mainly for the economic reasons, the fur trade. So the English and the Dutch, different story. They brought lots of settlers, and so they were then trying to, and worked at it violently or however else, to move Native Americans off the land permanently. The colonies experienced great hardships in the early years, probably most famously as Jamestown, Virginia, begun by the English in 1607, and it struggled to survive, I think, as we know, mightily in its first 10 years of existence. But all of the colonies on the North Atlantic seaboard struggled to one degree or another. Sometimes, as our textbook tells us, they survived at certain moments only by trading with Native Americans. But since they were oftentimes at war with Native Americans, this made trading with them sometimes difficult. Probably best not to go to war with people who's can have their lives or your lives in their hands because they provide you with food through trade. But sometimes there were ongoing animosities, or something happened that sparked a war. Either side could and sometimes did spark the war, but it put the early colonists, whether French, Dutch, English, in a bind. If they couldn't produce their own food, relied on Native Americans to trade for food, and then a war breaks out between them because Native Americans then would cut off the supply of food, at least until the war was over. Over time, the colonies learned through trial and error, and innovation and hard work, how to create ordered and prosperous colonies. Even Jamestown and the larger colony of Virginia around it, after about 10 years, started to figure things out and started to make profits and improve standard of living, at least for themselves, their European colleagues and friends, co-workers, families. Tobacco was one of the big crops in North America. Like we saw in Spain, it was mainly silver mining. In Portuguese Brazil, it was sugar growing. But in places like Virginia, I already mentioned, North Carolina, Maryland, even in the Caribbean, on some islands, tobacco was a major cash crop. One of the authors here, I forget which one this is, as colonists, I forgot to put it on here, as colonists' numbers increased, they sought to integrate their American holdings into the large capitalist economy of the Atlantic Ocean basin by producing cash crops that they could market in Europe. In the English colonies of Virginia and Carolina, settlers concentrated on the cultivation of tobacco, a plant integral to the indigenous societies of the Americas. In fact, Native Americans in some places had been sort of burning and smoking tobacco leaves for a long, long time. So the idea wasn't anything new. European demand for the addictive weed, as one English king called it, the disreputable weed. Now we have other disreputable weeds, but this was what I think King James I called the disreputable weed, resulted in skyrocketing exports amounting to about 20,000 pounds of tobacco exported, mostly to Europe in 1624, and by about 15 years later, it's up to 3 million pounds, and it kept going up from there. There were some down periods after this as well, when it leveled off, but the upward curve was generally pretty consistent. The colonists in, say, Virginia, the Carolinas, the English colonists, the ones that eventually declared independence and rose up in rebellion against Great Britain and became the United States of America, in growing tobacco, which, like sugar, is a very labor-intensive crop. You need lots of workers and laborers. Had some options and had some different ideas about what type of labor force to use. Who's going to do the work? If you were a big plantation owner and you wanted to make a lot of money, you had to have a lot of workers. So how do you get these? Well, one option were poor Englishmen who would, or this was the deal that came about, would sign a contract, the indenture contract. You see one of them actually on the left of the screen there. So it was actually a legally binding contract. And if you were an indentured servant, that meant that you belonged to that person that you signed the contract with, who owned the land for a certain amount of time, usually about 5 to 7 years. But the contracts varied from person to person, contract to contract. So in return, you would get your passage paid over to the New World from England, which sounds like not that big of a deal, but most people in England couldn't have afforded a ship across the, even just being aboard a ship across the Atlantic, even if they sort of saved up their, all their life savings. It was way more expensive than you might think. So for most Europeans or Englishmen, they would have never gotten to the New World, to America, unless this kind of deal was struck. So they got something at the front end of the contract, which was their passage aboard ship paid for, and they got something at the back end of the contract, which was the bigger deal, or sometimes called freedom dues, which mainly meant land. They were promised land after their indenture is up. So, but in the middle of the contract, right, they get something at the beginning and the end, but in the middle, for 5 to 7 years, whatever it was, you have to do a lot of work, and you can't quit the job for the person you signed the contract with. They paid for your voyage over. They're going to acquire land for you, but in the meantime, they more or less own you. Indentured servants were sort of like slaves. Probably life wasn't as bad overall, and that's probably at least in part because of racism. These were Englishmen, so they, there wasn't a racist factor in here like there were with African slaves. But life could be harsh for indentured servants. There was physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse with women, indentured servants. So it could be rough, but for some people it seemed like worth doing. Why? Well, Bentley tells us here, planters initially, again the plantation owners, met the demand for cheap labor by recruiting indentured servants from Europe. People who had little future in Europe were often willing to sell a portion of their working lives, like 5 years, for passage across the Atlantic and a new start in life. So for poor people in England and Europe as a whole, who had really no prospects to improve their lives, to get better jobs, to own land. Some people didn't own land and probably never would have a chance to own land if they stayed in England. So it's, to many of them, it seemed worth it. Okay, I worked for 5 to 7 years and I'm not free, but I will be, and I will at least have a chance to sort of move up in a way that I never would, or would be much less likely to here if I stay in Europe. But there were other options open to the Virginia and Carolina tobacco planters, plantation owners. And in fact, they tried 3 different groups of laborers. We already know the first one, indentured servants, through the course of the 17th century. The first shipment of slaves, about 20 of them, to be brought to North America, North American English colonies happened in 1619. And for the rest of that century, so for about 80 years, there was kind of an experiment done by the tobacco growers about what kind of labor force we're going to do. And all of the three you see on the screen, they tried. In fact, on some people's land, some plantations, there were English indentured servants working the land at the same time enslaved Native Americans were, at the same time that enslaved Africans or their descendants were. So some farmers or tobacco growers, planters, were using all three of these at the same time. Over time, however, they all, or almost all, came to believe that the best option for them, and they were thinking in terms of profit only, not humanity and not morality, certainly, that it was slaves from Africa that were the best deal for them, economically speaking. Why? Because indentured servants were still English, and English law gave them rights. They were English citizens, so you couldn't abuse them at least as easily. They were sometimes abused, but you get in some trouble because they're English citizens. And why would you want to abuse them? Well, because if you deprive them of food and spend less on their upkeep and well-being, more profit for you. Also indentured servants, weren't going to be there forever, so there'd be lots of turnovers every 5 to 7 years. One or more every year, basically. Somebody's contract is coming up, and now you got to find more indentured servants. Not that they weren't in plentiful supply, but it's kind of a hassle. This over time turned the Virginia planters and their counterparts in other colonies off to indentured servants being the labor force of choice. There was actually a trade, a slave trade in Native Americans in the Carolinas for a time, and this is how Native American slaves got to tobacco plantations in Virginia and other locations as part of it. That didn't work out in the end. At least that was sort of crossed off the list as a viable long-term labor source, primarily because Native Americans were in their own backyard. They could escape, and they knew the land. Their own group was probably not too far away, and they might try to find you, or if there were a bunch of Native Americans from the same tribe on one piece of land, their tribe might find you and not only rescue their people, but burn down your plantation and kill you in the process. So the potential of that was too great, since these people are in their own backyard, and so that didn't work out in the end either. Most enslaved Native Americans actually ended up on the Caribbean islands working on sugar plantations there, which makes sense given what I just said, because they then weren't in their own backyard, and their people weren't going to come and rescue them because there's still a lot of ocean in between, them and their people. But slaves imported from Africa under brutal conditions, as we'll see, you may already know, had sort of all of the advantages from the point of view of the owners, not from the slaves' point of view, that white English indentured servants didn't have, nor did Native Americans. So you didn't have to respect the citizenship or legal rights of slaves from Africa, which, by the way, you didn't have to Native Americans either if you were a Virginia planter, and you could abuse them more easily because they weren't citizens. You could also, it was more, I think, it was psychologically easier to abuse them in a way that saved you money and gave you more profit on the other end because of the difference in skin color and because of racism. So this was another, tragically, part of the equation. Also, of course, Native Americans were in their own backyard, but Africans were not. Right? They're a whole ocean and continent away from their own people. They're not being rescued anytime soon, not ever. So they're not going to be able to escape, at least, and find their people, or vice versa. So all the things that made indentured servants and enslaved Native Americans, not the right labor force, weren't true of slaves from Africa. Hence, the decision made by the end of the 17th century, when you start to see almost all the plantations move exclusively to slave labor, slaves from Africa. Again, it wasn't an actual experiment, and they weren't coordinating it, but it was. I'm sure they were comparing and talking to each other, neighbors, etc. And so there were some, there's some dialogue about it, but it wasn't a formal decision. But it ended up being an overwhelmingly, consistent decision. The viciousness and inhumanity of slavery is hard to put into words. It's so great. It's so gigantic, and it's difficult to talk about. Unspeakable cruelty that would actually only get worse for slaves, both in the English colonies, in the Caribbean islands, which eventually were taken over by the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, the Danish. The French were already, the Spanish were already there, but other countries kind of moved in and moved some of the Spanish out of the way on some sugar islands in the Caribbean. And also slavery, of course, inhumane, because it's inhumane, period, in the Portuguese area of Brazil, and in the Spanish colonies in Latin America. Among the other horrifying aspects of this was you see on the left, depicted in the drawing, the infamous Middle Passage. This is the voyage across the ocean from Africa to the New World in unbelievably inhumane and dangerous, unhealthy conditions. Slaves tied together, chained together below deck most of the time, not often allowed to come above deck, and not even allowed to really move or get up and walk around unless it was the allotted time to do so. And so it's just unbelievably horrifying, and again hard to read about and learn about. An incredible former slave, Ulada Equiano, who traveled all over the world and actually did experience the Middle Passage, but then escaped from slavery, ended up in England, traveled around, but became educated and became part of the abolitionist movement in England in the 18th century, the movement to abolish or make slavery illegal. And he wrote a great deal about a lot of things, but partly about his experiences as a slave. And he said of the Middle Passage in one of his writings, "The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable." So it's almost impossible to conceptualize how bad all of this was. You see the other two pictures there, yet another unspeakable, extremely difficult to contemplate aspect of slavery. And these are slave auctions. Once the slaves got through the Middle Passage, assuming they did, because many died or were sick by the time they got to the New World, got to the Americas, sometimes with illnesses that they never totally recovered from. But then they were auctioned off like they were animals at an auction, with owners, potential owners and buyers standing there looking at them like they were, like they were cattle. So the barbarity of all of this is really hard to overstate. It's really hard to find the words to. I'm fairly adept with words, what I do for a living, but it's pretty hard to describe this. Partly because it's emotional, but partly because it just sort of is so bad it defies description. Christianity and native religions in the Americas. So, as Professor Bentley and Ziegler tell us, European explorers, conquerors, merchants, and settlers took their religious traditions with them when they traveled overseas. they felt compelled to share their faith with the non-believers they encountered. And this was true whether it were Spanish Catholic priests, whether it was French Jesuit Catholic priests, English Protestant ministers. The English weren't quite as obsessed with converting Native Americans, but there was certainly some of it. John Eliot in Puritan New England is an example, the praying towns that he set up. And they believed they were doing something good. Now, whether they were or not, of course, might be a different story. But my point is that their intentions were good because they believed that they were providing to say that it was an invaluable service in their minds is an understatement, because they believed that Christianity was the right religion, and that if you didn't practice Christianity, you were going to burn in hell for eternity. And so they, in their minds, were saving souls, saving thousands, if not millions of people, Native Americans. And the Europeans did this everywhere they went in the world, by the way. We'll see that later. But they believed that they were doing this important service by getting people to practice the right religion. And they were convinced that their religion was the only proper one. So their missionary efforts were usually done with quite a bit of zeal. The conversion rates were pretty low overall, but Bentley and Ziegler do say French and English missionaries did not attract nearly as many converts to Christianity in North America as their Spanish counterparts did in Mexico and Peru, partly because French and English colonists did not rule over conquered populations of sedentary cultivators. They just sort of pushed them off the land further to the west, and then pushed them off again when they wanted more land. But as we've already seen in the Spanish territories and Portuguese-controlled territories, they were directly ruling over most of the native peoples. Not all, but at least those in the regions that they had overtaken. Catholic French missionaries worked actively among native communities, usually Jesuit priests, and experienced modest success in spreading Christianity. But overall, I think it's safe to say that the conversion rates were pretty low. Native American religions were quite different than Christianity, even though missionaries tried to find common ground and say, hey, your belief in this is like our belief in that over here. Tried to kind of make the two match up where they could, which may have worked to some degree. But Native Americans were kind of a tough sell on Christianity. That's not true everywhere in the world. But again, the two cultures, European culture on the one hand, Native American culture, although it was cultures because of the great diversity in Native America, but it was a tough sell. Spanish missionaries, William McNeill, in his Rise of the West, says missionaries became the pioneers of Spanish America when the gold fever of the conquistadors subsided. Since they were seeking souls, not gold, Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans were eager to penetrate comparatively primitive regions like Paraguay, the Orinoco Valley, where they erected a series of remarkable missionary principalities. Many missionaries on the scene tried to protect the rights of Indian populations under Spanish rule. And this is true. Not all Spanish priests, and maybe it gets overstated somewhat. I don't know the number. It probably wasn't even the majority. But enough of them were concerned that they did make some waves in Spain. And most famously in this regard is this gentleman, Bartolome de Lascas. He was originally a conquistador, as one scholar tells us from a really good book on sort of a large sweep of civilization around the world during this period, but sort of repented of his sins, became a priest, and spent, as it says, the second half of his long life opposing European cruelty in the Americas. So this is a former conquistador, soldier, had been involved in some of the cruelties, repented of it, felt guilty about it, became a priest, and dedicated himself as a priest in the Americas to not just Christianizing Native Americans, but essentially kind of being an advocate on their behalf to the Spanish government when he saw conquistadors continuing to maybe and even increasingly abuse Native Americans in slave-like conditions, in extremely difficult labor conditions, living conditions, etc. So Las Casas spoke out. He's a major source for historians today because many of his writings survive. I mean, he wrote a lot, first of all, but many of his writings survive. He wrote a whole history of the Spanish Americas, at least up until his own day, and kept a diary. And so he's fascinating to read because when you read his words, his criticisms of his own countrymen, his own country, Spain, for its cruel treatment of Native Americans, really is an argument that we can understand because he's making a moral argument, saying these people are human beings. And they're being treated like animals, and it's unchristian, it's unjust, it's immoral, it's intolerable. And he wasn't a king, but he became a pretty influential priest. He at one time went to Spain, back to Spain, had a debate with another major Catholic figure in the church who didn't agree that Native Americans deserve to be treated humanely, as odd as that sounds. And De Las Casas didn't necessarily get what he wanted, but he was one of those that was at least partially responsible for ending the encomienda and getting the repartimiento already mentioned in place. And we saw that the repartimiento didn't solve the problem of abusive labor conditions on plantations or on haciendas, but it probably did so at least mildly to some degree. Las Casas, I'm sure, was disappointed in it because I'm sure he thought it should have gone further. We should say that by our standards today, Las Casas would seem like a racist because he did believe that Europeans were likely superior to Native Americans, so that's racist. Fair enough. But since he's one of the few Europeans that's saying anything at all critical of European treatment of Native Americans and saying, hey, look, these people are human beings. We cannot treat them like this. It's completely unethical, completely immoral. The cruelty, is sadistic, and it must stop. For the time, that's going an awful long way from a European society which didn't think like this as a whole. Oftentimes didn't give a second thought to how other people outside of Europe were treated, and even by Europeans.